Nick, some reflection, or one reflection on what you heard this afternoon.
Well, the three speakers before me illustrated the climate apocalypse quite nicely, didn't they? The scenarios that we're facing and the way in which the human and non-human are all in it together.
Yeah, I think it's very important, the justice aspect of climate action that's been highlighted, but also I guess my question would be how do we bring about the action? Like at the moment the problem we're facing is lack of political will, and how do we change that and actually start changing direction?
I was really struck by John's 5 ideas of hope with teeth, and I found that it's a challenge for a group of Christians who might put a little too much onus on what God needs to do for us, as opposed to the really solid grounds, not only of our faith in God, but of lessons from the past on where we can draw hope and how change can be achieved.
I'll just say, well, firstly, that I thought that was an incredibly rich and interesting conversation. But the thing that struck me, as often does, is we need really deep change and we need really fast change. We need the depth of cultural and spiritual change, but it needs to happen fast for all the reasons that Kate and others were talking about. So how do we drive deep and fast change is the question I'm keen to hear people's thoughts on.
Thank you. We've got a number of questions, and given the time, I think, if you don't mind, we'll sort of dig into those questions. One of the ones at the top now, seven likes. We all contribute to climate change. What are the limits to reasonable consumerism? Is eating more than necessary problematic? What about having children? Anyone keen to be first cab off the rank, just for something light?
Obviously, for those of it, can you hear me? Yeah, obviously for those of us who are Christian, be fruitful and multiply has been fulfilled. I guess we always have to remember, for those of us in the West, it's not simply the population, but it's the level of affluence. So population is often used as a scapegoat to point to the quote-unquote developing world, where the per capita emissions are very much smaller than ours. Dietary changes are one of the things we're going to have to face as a confirmed carnivore. I struggle with that, but the reality is that that's one of the many things that we can do. More broadly about deep change, I think individual action is one thing, but collective action as the church or as people of goodwill is another thing to help drive policy change. And it's those large-scale infrastructure things that are required to change to transform society. So it's one thing to say, individuals, you ride a bike or you won't consume this, that or the other, to not use petroleum, but ultimately we need to shift the dial on the entire way the system is structured, and taxation is one way of that happening. So it's neither an either or, I think. Anyone else want to comment?
I'll just make one comment, which is I think the discussion all around the world, I mean, we know answers like, yes, we should get rid of fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and yes, we should shift to renewable energy, and yes, we need regenerative land use. I think the question of consumption is starting to become more and more important. That's not just a question about individual choices. It's a question about how we think about larger issues like advertising, just for example. But I think we will need to rethink how we think about consumption of goods and services, and that's firstly because that's crucial for reducing emissions, but it's crucial for all the other ecological issues we've been talking about as well. The old story about infinite growth on a finite planet was always going to be a problem, and it's starting to come home to roost, I think.
Over to, not that I want to leapfrog talking more about mitigation, if we don't get deep and fast change, and I would say even if we do get fast and deep change, what's adaptation going to look like for us? And I guess I'd sort of fill out that question. What role might churches play as communities ideally communities of hope and action within the broader context. So yeah, what does adaptation look like? What role might churches play in a hopeful, positive scenario?
You and I wrote a book about that, didn't we? So maybe you can comment later. Someone else want to go before I do?
I could just say something briefly first about adaptation in terms of, yes, we're already in a space where we have to adapt to climate change. If we're very, very lucky, we limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, but that's a lot. It's already a lot of change climate, so we have to adapt. And then there's limits to adaptation. You could argue about what those limits are, but I think a 3-degree world would be very difficult for humanity to adapt to. And others probably will pick up on this more, but adaptation is very much about, obviously, the whole society. We need to be a very good, all of the tenets of justice and an egalitarian and a distributed wealth. If we don't have a society that displays all of those characteristics, adaptation will also go very poorly.
Just one comment. You asked a question about the role of the church. I think it's this is a reflection on the role of all the different organisations in our communities. I agree. There's a limit. There are absolutely limits to adaptation, and maybe we need to be talking about words like resilience and regeneration and some words like that as well. But what we know, surely, from every example of disaster, even from the pandemic, is that one of the critical factors in any adaptation, resilience, regeneration is our community, our connectedness, our mutual support. And it seems to me that all kinds of community organisations, including churches, are going to be absolutely critical in that. So I think it's how we bring people together under often very difficult circumstances that's going to be really vital, I think.
One thing I might say is a little bit, just to tease out again what I said earlier, is that do we stand for the status quo and what is lawful, or do we stand for what is right, what's moral? Hard for some of us given our employment, but at what point do we take risks to stand out there to get arrested, or to lobby really hard to buck our traditions that say our first and primary role is to proclaim the gospel, as if the only thing that we can do is share or shove down someone's throats the particular tenets of our faith, rather than firstly embodying love? What do we do when the climate refugees start literally pouring in? What do we do if there's not enough food to go around? Are you willing to go without eating for a day so that someone else might? What are the radical acts of love? If you remember during, is it Justinian's plague? The one thing that distinguished the Christians from the quote-unquote pagans at the time, that they were nicking off out of the cities and fleeing the dead and dying, and it's the Christians who were staying behind and caring for those who were sick. And I think you talked earlier, mentioning a Buddhist poet, about being present in the midst of the world's suffering. Remember, Romans 8 says that the whole world is groaning in birth pains, and the Spirit groans with us. It's going to be very much about whether or not we're going to embody Jesus in everyone's lives on a daily basis and groan with them in the midst of all this suffering. We're dealing with climate grief, dealing with how it's impacting the global poor. What are we going to do with the funds that we have, holding on to all the rich resources that the church owns at a denominational level? Are we going to distribute that to the poor in a kind of Jubilee type fashion?
Thank you. So we've heard about radical love, and maybe we can workshop some of the more radical things. People say, when are you getting an EV? And I've been holding out, and I'm hoping that actually I'll go to no car. And I was thinking that could be quite radical to say, I can't come because I can't actually have checked and there's no viable way to get there at the moment. And then I lobby the public transport network and say this needs to be better. Once I suggested shaving my head as a sort of, again, a symbolic thing of going, it's a very low emissions car. I don't need to drive Australian used product. I don't know, is that true? We lower emission cars. My friend at the time was horrified at my suggestion, but I was thinking of the Clapham sect and this, I don't take sugar in my tea, and here's the reason why. It's a conversation starter, and Catherine Haydoe says one of the most powerful things we can do is keep talking about it rather than remain silent because it's uncomfortable. So I'd be interested in ideas, maybe at the radical end, but also at the everyday symbolic, this might be a conversation starter or another reminder that we are in crisis, because we live within an economy that wants us to forget, so that we keep buying stuff. Whereas I think one of the wisest things we can do is prepare for some lean years. Buying less is part of the response, but it might also free up resources that we'll need in the coming years. So what are some of those practical things? And they might be small yet symbolic, or they might be costly and radical. So you might think about your household or a community or an organisation you're part of. So what are some of those practical things we can do beyond lobbying very powerful people, or as a form of lobbying?
I was really struck by something Tony Renato said when interviewed about his book, of how he got traction in all the different countries he worked in. And he said talking to people and assuming they loved their children was his starting point. And I reckon that's a great conversation starter. Anybody you talk to probably loves their children or their grandchildren. And what does 2050 look like for them? For me, is a sobering and motivating and immediate connection with just about anybody if you're wanting a conversation starter. And I thought that was really clever coming from an ecologist. We're not renowned for that sort of insight.
I was thinking of a conversation I had. Some of you will know the climate scientist, University of Melbourne climate scientist David Caroli, and I remember talking with David, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, and saying, what would be, how can we imagine really accelerating, change? What's really going to kind of drive this change at the necessary speed? And at that time, we sort of talked about, what if there were, these terrible fires that, went all up and down the east coast of Australia, and of course, that surely that would get people moving. And I mean, worryingly, we've seen that, and we're still perhaps not seeing change at sufficient speed. But I had the conversation with him again more recently, and one of the things we talked about was the law and the impact of legal cases being brought by young people, by older people, cases bringing into question the legality, the human rights case in relation to coal mining, fossil fuel mining. And I think, I'm just using that one thought, the role of litigation of the law as a way of both actually having a serious impact on investment decisions, but also on bringing these issues into public vision. So that's just one particular thought, contribution to your question.
I just wanted to briefly add something. I mean, there's so many thoughts or ideas about that, but from my personal experience, my grandfather was a prisoner in World War II, and he was a big part of my childhood, and he was so thrift and so repaired everything and so innovative and never wasted food, like not a spoonful. And it's just a lifestyle, I think, not just people who fought in World War II, but lived through the Great Depression. And we're losing the generation who experienced that kind of life. So I would say talking to people who lived through that or can remember it, or maybe they grew up with parents who lived through that, and understanding that this sort of level of wealth and consumerism that we live in is very recent and very damaging, and there's other ways to live. So that's potentially a conversation people can have in families.
A couple of years ago, I provided the data from NASA. I mean, it had already been done in the UK to Common Grace, which is a Christian aid and advocacy group. And I didn't really know what they wanted to do with it, but they needed all these scarves. And then we went to Canberra and presented these to parliamentarians and senators and said, can you do something about climate change? So I think there's a spectrum of things that we can do, from those who want to get arrested. My mate Jared McKenna, for those who know him, said, we should get arrested together sometime. I said, with my job, I don't think I can, sorry mate. But, we can talk to politicians. They actually, I don't know what it is. And I think ultimately that, and hear me right when I say this, I think Canberra is demonic. I'm not saying that the individuals of politicians are demonic. When I speak to them, they're reasonable and rational individuals who care about their kids and their grandkids and about their constituents and so on. And you can have a real conversation with them on a personal level about these sorts of things. But then there's this whole, system. The day we were there was the day that Barnaby Joyce was re-elected, and there was all that thing about what had happened to various interns, and so you walk through the halls of power and realise there's something really wrong here. But the actual individuals, if you approach them as individuals and people of good faith and so on, they are willing to listen. It's a small thing, but this was a really winsome and nice way of not getting in their face, but saying, here's a present, and by the way, let me tell you what it means and what I'd like you to do, ideally. Yep.
Just your point there about talking to people. I can, in a previous life, I worked as a public servant in the Premier's Department in Victoria, and I remember, so you're talking with ministers about what would affect their views, and the assumption is that if enough data is put in front of them and enough evidence, that will change people's mind. And I'm all for evidence-based policy making, but in my experience, that's not on the whole what really changes people's mind. It's the personal kind of communication. It's that, and the number of times where ministers would say, "My goodness, I went to this school and these parents talked to me, and it really." And I think it goes to your point about actually, to put it one way, getting right up close and personal with people in power where you can. And really making quite clear the strength of your views. I wouldn't underestimate the importance of that. I think it's really, it's an important part of the social change and political change process.
Mick, you used the word spectrum, which reminded me of a conversation that sort of broke out on social media where someone I know created a neurodiverse Slack channel for their workplace, which was an environmental organisation, and 10% of the staff ended up joining, didn't have to have a diagnosis but an interest or an inkling. And that conversation developed, and I said, I'm curious, I think there's a PhD in there for someone looking at environmental concern and neurodiversity. And then a Greens senator weighed in and said, you wouldn't believe how many people in the Greens party are somewhere on the spectrum. I'm just thinking about this sort of moral enhancement and genetics and diversity and hearing voices, and you had a picture there of Greta. I'm reminded of a friend of mine, Jasper Lee, who's a dentist in Adelaide, but he was on a podcast about what he's doing as a dentist. But he also said, I've been on the spectrum, it means I've got a greater capacity to kind of carry this emotional load that others would find too overwhelming. Just wondering if anyone wants to sort of explore that in terms of hearing voices, those that are willing to say the world's on fire. Enough talk, blah, 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 to world leaders. That's courageous from a young girl.
Well, I've got Aboriginal friends who would say that they've been fighting climate change for 250 years. And it is true. When we look for models of resilience, when we understand the current era of the Anthropocene as originating in settler capitalism and colonialism, etc., Indigenous peoples of the world were the first sufferers of that phenomenon, and I guess the poor in Europe and so on, who were made to make the engines of capitalism work. So looking to them for their resilience, listening to them and their experiences, reconnecting with their wisdom about how they managed the lands on which we now live, I think is critical. And as I was talking to someone earlier over afternoon tea, I think I've learned a snippet of insight about how to understand the Bible through Indigenous eyes. I said earlier, I think the book of Leviticus contains the idea of animism. The book of Genesis also contains the idea of ceremony and human agency in maintaining the order of good creation. It's the same thing from Indigenous stories. For Christians, you read the book of Revelation, it talks about people from every tribe, nation and tongue, and yet, I feel guilty now, here's the white male sat up the front preaching that as the church we need to listen to the entirety of global Christianity, because they will bring perspectives that we will miss and help us to mine further the resources of our faith. But even outside of that, the traditional wisdoms and understandings of those peoples that we would otherwise marginalise are essential. We're all in this together. They're the people who started suffering first, but it's catching up to us now.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on one of John's Teeth with Hope points was disruptive brilliance of creative people with imagination, and just sharing my own experience of working with creative people and reflecting on where big campaigns in the past, like Saving the Franklin, driven by Peter Dombrowski's paint a photo, emotive photo, said a whole lot more than a whole bunch of scientists' data. It moved hearts and minds. I've got strangely involved in a theatre production of The Seagull, talking with an artistic director about that. And I got involved with an art display in North Melbourne to open an art centre display that was based on wildlife camera shots of foxes, and someone had done something artistic with that. And what struck me when I went in to open that exhibition, this wasn't my tribe. These are people with piercings and hair colours that were foreign to me. But they were communicating with a whole bunch of different people that my standard sort of audience as a nerdy scientist would be. And so I think the more we can link hands and recognise that not everyone's moved by graphs and data.
Can I build on that? There's a fantastic website which I'll point you to called Your Climate Superpowers, and it's been developed by a number of young researchers at the University of Melbourne and in collaboration with school students near here. And basically, if you go there, you'll find what they've done is, step one, when you go to this website, you're encouraged to identify your superpower. Are you a writer? Are you an organiser? Are you good at data? Are you good at activism? So point one, what's your superpower? And then point two, of course, you're encouraged to, in collaboration with others, work out your superpower mission. In collaboration to work out which politician are you going to try and influence, which coal mine are you going to try and stop. And so again, and it's beautifully illustrated as well with animations and so on. So I think again that's an example of thinking outside the box in terms of the ways in which we move the dial.
Last week I presented at a careers expo and I was talking about the shift towards this sort of for purpose, away from just for profit. And I talked about B Corps and social enterprises. This question was directed at Mick, but I think we could all have a go, and I guess I've given a few hints as to where I find some hope and where I'm shifting my money in terms of banking and super, and when I do buy new, I'll try and go to a place like Kathmandu, which is probably not perfect, but I know they're B Corp, so they've sort of made a statement that they are committed to increasingly doing what they can. So Mick, the question was, is capitalism the problem? What's a better alternative? Should we not use the structures of Western democracies to reduce our emissions? And that's gotten bumped up to 6 likes. So.
Oh, I might go on. Viva la revolution. Look, I mean, to make a general kind of summary and then maybe try and fill in the details, if I look at the redistributive economics and justice of like Jubilee and so on, it's not about penalising people for having a lot necessarily, it's making sure that everyone has enough. So communism, this might be a bit of a caricature, says that everyone should be paid the same and look the same and purchase the same and so on, and it's enforced uniformity. So don't adopt a binary when I say capitalism is the issue. Well, what's the particular issue of capitalism is the sorts of things we've talked about earlier, as it treats the planet and other people as inputs into a system that produces more products for the profits of a few. So transforming that in a way that is kinder and gentler and more ecologically friendly is a big enterprise. And you need to do that, I guess, within it. And we all live within it quite regardless. The analogy I like to use, I suppose, is Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, not blessed are the peaceable." And I know there's a long tradition of mystics and monastics and so on, and people removing themselves totally from the world, and we could advocate a totally parallel economic system. And I know in a sense Islam talks about that because they have ethical borrowing and it's free of interest and so on and so forth. So you could adopt ethical super or Christian super, you could tap into local cooperatives, you could do all those sorts of things, and I think they're appropriate both as a sound practice or testing ideas out, but also as a witness to the larger world. But ultimately, we want to transform structures. I'm all about making the whole, all things new. So you've got to do that within and advocate within. But I know that that's a hard road because there's so much vested interest in that. Is that anywhere near the question? Hand on.
Yeah, can I say something? I'd just like to say in the strongest possible terms that capitalism and democracy are not inherently linked. There are many, many alternative economic models that are democratic. And we definitely need an alternative to capitalism. That's the link to the over-consumerism and the climate and biodiversity crises. And there's been a lot of growing academic attention, and John can probably talk more about it, around what's called the degrowth movement, and a planned, orderly transition into a different economic model that's not reliant on infinite growth on a finite planet. So that's definitely something we need.
Only to agree. I mean, there's, we could have a conversation about what's the best language. Is it degrowth or is it post-growth or is it a different kind of well-being economy? But the bottom line comes back to, firstly, for both the climate and the biodiversity crisis, we can't keep growing, we can't keep expanding the consumption of goods and services in the way we are. I always think, a good way to look at this is, there are some things we really want to grow. I mean, I'm all for growing better caring services, more childcare, better health services. There are things we would like to grow, and maybe there's a few really, really large SUVs that we might like to grow a little less. But it does, I think, so I'm completely in agreement with the importance of rethinking this question of growth. I think it does come back, and the discussion about the kind of economic model we have as well, it does come back, I think, to this question of how do we get really deep change and how do we get really fast change, because the physics of the planet won't allow us to. Martin Luther King used to talk about the arc of history moves towards justice over time, and I'm sure he's right, but will the physics allow us to wait for that historical change, or do we need to kind of get on with it and really move the dial quickly at the moment? And I feel as though when we look at what's happening in Europe or Africa or China at the moment, we're getting given a very clear wake-up call that we need to act fast.
Quickly plug one book. Kate Raworth's Donut Economics is well worth a read, and I see some nods on this call.
And another plug, given that a lot of people here are Melbourne-based, there's a group called Regen Melbourne, and they have modified the donut. They have the Melbourne donut, and one of the projects affiliated with that is Swim Birrarung. So there are people that would love to return the Yarra River to a swimmable state. Now, if you have a big audacious goal, that is certainly one. So again, these are where you sort of find yourself in a different tribe, but with lots of energy and optimism and goodwill and community and solidarity. So, seek these groups out because you need to sustain the journey, and things like this help. I will posit the question and then pass this microphone back to you because it has gotten 9 expressions of interest. How should we respond as Christians to those who are promoting climate alarmism without tangible solutions? We kind of touched on this in terms of what are the practical things we can do. Alarmism is one thing, denialism is another, if you want to tackle that, either or, but I'll send the microphone back down.
Just before I answer that, another website or I'll point you to is the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is the alliance which now involves a number of governments around the world, Scotland, Norway, I think, New Zealand, Canada, really starting to take seriously the concept of a well-being economy, and I think that's it's related to the donut economics idea as well. So your question is how to
respond to people promoting climate alarmism but without solutions.
And do you mean by alarmism sort of we've got a crisis, it's all going to hell, but yeah.
That was the question. I think maybe the more despair orientated positioning.
Yeah, I mean, I think and I'd be keen to hear the other views on this panel. finding the right balance in the way we talk about the severity of the situation, and not turning away, not pretending it's not difficult, but also not driving people into despair or paralysis, I think is really a challenging balancing act, and I think we all wrestle with that, and I imagine everyone here does too. And I think perhaps one additional comment I'd make, somebody who I often find has really thoughtful things to say about this is, some of you may know the American writer Rebecca Solnit, and who has written a lot about hope in the darkness as one of her books, and I strongly recommend that. But she talks about, she really emphasises, well, two things I'd point to. One is that history is always full of surprises. I mean, we may think that things look really, hard to see how we're going to get out of this. But as I mentioned earlier, when we look back at the history of apartheid or the history of the Berlin Wall, if you talk to people at the time, they thought this would never, I remember people in South Africa, not too long before the end of apartheid saying this is going to be here forever. And history does teach us that the world can change quite fast. So I think it's important, alongside really clear messages about how dire the situation is, to have really good stories about how we can bring about change as well.
Yeah, for me, those stories are really important, and those of us who have lived a bit longer need to, I guess, draw the strength from our previous generations, the ones through the Great Depression and the war. They faced real threats. On a more mundane level, though, if you look outside that window, for those of us who grew up in Melbourne, on a day like today in Melbourne when I was growing up, the air would be filled with smog because people would be burning their autumn leaves in the gutter. That is now not a done thing. There's a complete behaviour shift. The asthmatics in Melbourne must be breathing more clearly. We just take it for clear. It's clear out there today. It's possible to change. The all-time winner for me, and I may have mentioned this before, is dog poo. If we can convince human beings to pick up warm dog poo, which we seem to have done, anything's possible in my view. That's a transformation.
That's certainly one of the most hopeful things I've heard. One thought to offer on this, I think, because you also mentioned denialism. Climate denialism keeps morphing. There's actually a really good paper on this, now I forget what it's called, with a great animation of all the different kinds of climate denialism. And so I think one of the latest morphs is into alarmism. And so certainly not everyone who's being alarmist is a climate denier, but I think it's easy for some people to move into that space where they're effectively denying that anything can be done. And that's absolutely not true. Everything that we need to do to tackle climate change is available to us in terms of technology. It's just the political will to start doing it, and so keeping that in mind and understanding that. And yeah.
You don't have too much to it.
Given that we are almost at time, to want to sort of bring this round to imagination, which I think we've sort of touched on in different ways, but that need for hopefulness, stories. I've found myself at Gembrook Retreat. For those who don't know where Gembrook is, sort of go past the Dandenongs and travel a bit more. They run active hope sort of retreat workshops, and they draw on Joanna Macy's work quite a lot, and she's got a model, the work that reconnects, but looking at business as usual, and that is devastating for us. Other people would call it a sort of suicide machine, that it is killing us, ecocide, and the great unravelling, which is deeply disturbing to be a part of and to see it and to know that others are suffering, and not just humans but the non-human aspects of creation. We've heard about these knock-on impacts and these tipping points and things coming back around in a sense to bite us. I mean, that was such a powerful image that was used in terms of the smoke that comes back around and causes floods a year later. Quite devastating. So business as usual, the great unravelling, but then the great turning, and they've got some wonderful imaginative practices, such as sitting in the room with your great-grandchildren who are talking to you saying, I hear you're a part of the Great Turning, and now we're the recipients, 100 years old. What is it that you were doing? And it's an invitation to creative, imaginative exploration in terms of what might be. And that's where we're hearing that people were stuck in these situations feeling hopeless. So again, the artists and the poets and the creatives and their role in leading us courageously and inspiring ways into a preferable future. Was there anyone in the audience who was desperate to ask a question and didn't have Slidos? Anything that's been missed? And we've got a question over there. Do you want to stand up?
For Christians who are kind of fairly solid in their faith, they believe Jesus will return and fix it all, and it looks like it's coming soon. What do you say to them?
Oh, I know you love this one, Mick. And we've also got another taker. Maybe come back to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Someone will help me here, but Paul addressed it in Corinthians where people were sitting on their hands. So if you're a faithful Christian, it's just not an option. It was addressed way back then when people had stopped working because Jesus was coming just round the corner. We've been here before, we shouldn't be there again.
In Romans 8, Paul describes the church as the first fruits of the new creation. And so we're meant to be it. And if that's the return of ecological balance and restoration, and God makes all things new, then surely we should be embodying that right now, because otherwise, it's unfaithfulness, it's absurd, and it's disobedience, as I said earlier.
Yeah.
Hi. Max Becker from Brisbane. Dr. Kate, question that I've heard of, so no scientific thing that I'm no scientist. I heard that the volcanoes in Iceland and the fissures that were there a few years ago when the skies went black and the aircrafts were all suspended, that in about a month it did as much CO2 into the air and less oxygen, obviously, as 12 months in CO2 by the Europe. Could you talk about that? I realised that.
A really short response, and then it might have to be an offline conversation.
We need to wrap up.
Yeah, there's climate models that show, so it's just part of the Earth's natural cycle, and there's models that show, they compare global warming with just the Earth's natural cycle of CO2, of volcanoes and other ways that CO2 is emitted, compared to if we also add human emissions, and without the human emissions, with just volcanoes, we don't get the warming that we're observing.
And just to follow on with that, this prayer, your will be done, your kingdom come on earth as in heaven, and we put action behind those prayers, we don't just use words. And on that note, I'll pass to Chris for wrapping up.
Thank you, Claire. I'd like you all to turn around and look at that little girl clapping in her father's arms. We were talking about children born in 2020. Well, she was born in 2022. Her name is Nora. She belongs to Kenneth and Sonia. Sonia's a board member of ISCAST. So a lot of what we've been talking about today has to do with Nora, doesn't it? I mean, look around. A lot of us will be stimulated by this conversation, but we will be dead when the real impacts of transhumanism, genetic engineering, climate change come upon us. Some of us won't, but some of us are resigned not to living forever in this current form. Let me put my glasses on. So, thank you so much to our speakers this afternoon. You have done a great job of stimulating us to ponder, as Mick would say. Please don't forget to get your gift from the book table before you leave today. Please give them a round of applause.